So back here in Remote 1, we've already installed the roles and role services associated with the remote access role and direct access. So all we have to really do is come back here under Tools, and then down here under Remote Access Management, launch the little wizard that gets direct access then configured. Now, if you haven't actually watched the immediately previous module, you might actually go through and spend the hour taking a look at it, because in order for us to get this far, back in that last module, we went through the implementation of a VPN, a traditional VPN. We also went through the implementation of a web application proxy down here. So there are some configurations that have already been laid into place that we'll be taking advantage of, as it were, in order to support this direct access implementation. Let me come back here to VPN because I want to show you right here this Enable Direct Access link that exists up here at the top. It's here where we can now go through the Direct Access wizard. And a very simple wizard that we have to go through here. It's really just a couple of clicks in order to get this thing initially turned on. Now, this prerequisite check here, if you don't have an externally resolvable address, if you don't have any of the other prerequisites, what you just saw a second ago will take an extremely long period of time for it to identify whether or not those prerequisites exist. So one of the kind of gut checks as to whether or not you've got all the prereqs in place is just if you get to this next page in the wizard relatively quickly. This next page is where you can identify one or more security groups. Now, these are computer security groups that will grant access for those machines to interact with direct access. Now, it is exactly at this point that I want to give you a little piece of advice so you don't end up going down the path that I went down accidentally the very first time I went through configuring this direct access wizard. You may, just in the name of convenience, decide to actually end up using one of the built-in Active Directory groups, like domain computers, for example, as the group you would use here in the Direct Access wizard. However, be aware that this group has some far-reaching effects, particularly when it comes time to apply the group policy objects that will be created a little later on in this wizard. As you'll learn in just a second, these group policy objects go about actually configuring the client components of direct access. And it is probably not a great idea for you to deploy out all those client components to every single computer, every server, and every workstation in your domain. This is particularly the case when you deselect the checkbox down here to remove the restriction on mobile computers only. So it's my great recommendation that instead of using any of the built-in groups, that you go about creating your own custom group, one that you create yourself, just an Active Directory group. And then once you have that group, populate it with the computer accounts of the machines that you specifically want to add in here as direct access computers. So these will be the machines that you have specifically blessed as being those that can access the internal resources using direct access. And don't end up using any of those built-in groups because, trust me, that can actually create some far-reaching consequences for you as these group policy objects begin to apply. Now, down here is a checkbox that is probably one you may want to deselect. It depends on what your configuration is. This checkbox actually does a bit of a WMI filter on the machines that are part of the group to only enable direct access for those that it considers to be mobile computers. That WMI filter will appear in how the GPO actually gets applied. So when we create this GPO here in a second, and we'll limit the application of the GPO to just those that fulfill that WMI query for mobile computers. I'm going to deselect this here because I have just regular versions of Windows that we're using here in VMware Workstation, so they would not fulfill that requirement to be mobile computers. Also, in a production sense, if you're using direct access, this notion of force tunneling down here provides a way for you to force all of the traffic for a direct access enabled machine through your internal network before it attempts to access anything in the outside world. This is an important design decision that you have to make. If you think about this, if a person is sitting in a hotel room somewhere and needs to get to google.com, when you turn on force tunneling, that person will have to have the network traffic come back to your data center, then from there to Google through your existing proxy servers and firewalls and whatever else exists, then back to the data center and then back to you. Force tunneling is done for security reasons to ensure that that machine only speaks through the existing security controls that you have in place. But as you can imagine, if you're forcing all the traffic for every machine, no matter where they may be, through your data center, well, there's going to be some impact there on performance. So you have to decide whether or not you want to trade the additional security and the monitorability of that traffic for reducing the performance of the laptops when they're off your network. I will choose not to use forced tunneling here so that it supports split tunneling, meaning that anything not going to your data center will go directly to the location it needs to go, google.com and the variety of other websites that are out there. I'll choose next here, and we'll move on to the next screen where we can determine what the network topology will be for this server. Now the wizard here will attempt to determine the best topology to use, but this is something that you should probably know before you ever get to this page in the wizard screen. There are three major topologies that you would use for this our simplified deployment scenario, and each of these three depends on where the direct access server sits and how many NICs are installed onto it. For the top one up here, the direct access server sits directly on the edge network. So there's no additional device like a firewall or ISA server or TMG server or whatever that sits between your direct access server and the rest of the internet. In an edge deployment scenario, you have to have two different NICs. This is just exactly the same as how we configured things back in the last module for the traditional VPN and web application proxy. Now, if you do have that edge device, if you have some kind of firewall that sits in front of direct access, you would use either of these two bottom topologies down here. The first of which being the separation of traffic into two different network adapters, the second of which being the consolidation into a single network adapter. And again, this is a design decision for how you want to end up deploying your direct access server and if you have other equipment to set it behind. In our configuration, we actually have our DA server directly on the internet. The external address is an external address. So we'll choose the edge topology here. Now remember, that direct access server is domain joined. So if you use it in the edge configuration, you have what is effectively a domain joined machine that can be accessed directly from the internet. So all caveats apply for that configuration. Now down here, we also have the ability to type in the public name for any clients that are connecting to the remote access server. You'll notice that this is grayed out. And this is currently grayed out for us because the wizard is attempting to use that existing certificate that already is on the machine. It knows what that external name is going to be. So it knows that remote1.company.pri is the external name because that was configured earlier in that last module when we went through the work here for the VPN. I want that to be the same. That's still that external name. So we'll go through hitting the next button here to get us to our DNS suffix search list. Now, I already kind of explained in that inside-outside world that we have when we're dealing with VPNs, we have to worry about network resolution and DNS resolution because a client can be inside or a client can be outside. What this wizard allows us to do is to configure our direct access clients with a DNS client suffix search list that essentially says, if you need to access something on the inside net, well, this is the suffix that will be appended to any of the requests that you're attempting to use. Our users are used to accessing resources by host name. So if your server's name is Bob, the users probably type in Bob to get to it as opposed to bob.company.pri. And so what this does is it simplifies things for the users so that they don't have to remember to type in the entire fully qualified domain name to access all their resources. I will enable this here and choose the next button to take us here to our GPO configuration. It is here where direct access will go through configuring a client and a server GPO with all the necessary settings for both my DA server and for all the DA clients. Now, as you can imagine, using group policy as the mechanism for configuring the clients kind of solves a problem while it adds a hurdle at the same time. So it solves a problem because the users don't have to do anything. All the necessary bits will be automatically configured on their machines so that when they leave the office, they'll be able to continue accessing their resources. However, if you have clients in the outside world, those domain joined machines have to come back inside for a long enough period of time to get that group policy so that it can be appropriately configured. So this is something that you should definitely pay attention to when you go through implementing your direct access solution. It is a strong recommendation that you do not edit any part of these GPOs once they've been configured by the direct access wizard. In fact, Microsoft's website strongly suggests that you never touch them because doing so could have some unexpected results. Let's go through and then create both of these here in our company domain, the client settings and server settings GPO, so that we can support the setting of both of these different characteristics. Let me click the next button here, which takes us to the final page here in the DA wizard. One of the things you may want to do before you click finish here is just click here to edit these wizard settings. Now, there are, as I said, a variety of different settings that are configured. You may just want to verify that these settings are appropriate for the configuration that you're looking for. One such change would be here under remote clients. So we already configured these, but what we did not configure was this network connectivity assistant. You'll notice first this little dialog box here at the top, which is a location where you could potentially add additional tests for clients to determine whether they're on the internal network or not. Now, for our purposes, we already have an NLS server that's baked into our direct access server itself, so there's no need for additional tests here. But if you wanted to, you could just simply add those in here into this location, and the client would use that as another mechanism to determine whether or not it's on that internal network or not. But what you may want to do is configure down here a help desk email address and a direct access connection name that is more appropriate for your users. I have been told that there are some very useful log files that don't actually get created if you don't enter in an email address here in this location during the initial setup. So whether or not you have a help desk email address or not, you may just want to punch in an email address in here to support the creation and transfer of those appropriate log files. So helpdesk at company.pri, for example. Down here for the direct access connection name, it is this connection name that will appear in the charms view whenever you end up deploying these group policy objects out to your clients. So if I hit the Windows button C key here and go to Settings and then the network, it is this workplace connection view that will appear in the list of connections here on those desktops once they've received and processed the group policy. A final recommendation is this checkbox down here that suggests to allow direct access clients to use local name resolution. Local names in this context refers to the notion of short names, so server1 as opposed to server1.company.pri. Obviously, clients have to have some way to resolve these short names, and by checking the box here, you're essentially giving the clients the ability to use their local name resolution to resolve those short names, as opposed to forwarding them off to the corporate DNS servers. I'll choose Finish here to complete this, and then we can go back through and scroll down to all the other configurations here. Here are the configurations for the direct access configuration, whether or not VPN is enabled. If we click the change button here, we can see what are effectively the network topology here, the network adapters that are used, both on the outside, this is my 193.169 net address, and on the inside, my 192.168.0 address, as well as the certificate that should be used to authenticate the IP HTTPS connections. Now, in your world, you may choose to use this self-signed certificate. The self-signed certificate should support needs for a small environment. This is where the use of that third-party trusted certificate can greatly simplify things. Let me come back here under Browse so we can take a look at the list of possible certificates. You should have already installed that publicly trusted certificate onto your server so that it can be available here in this list of those. I'll be using this top certificate here because it's the one that's been configured for that external client support. If I choose Next here, we can take a look at the VPN configuration. It's here where we determine what mechanism is used to deliver the addresses to the incoming clients. Now, back on that last module when we were talking about traditional VPN, there were two different approaches you could use. If you had a DHCP relay and a DHCP server inside your network, you could assign those addresses directly from DHCP. Or if you wanted to make things simpler, you could assign them from a static address pool that was managed by the remote access server itself. These are going to be internal addresses, so they'll be 192.168.0 addresses. We've already set up that appropriate relay so we can use the DHCP server to distribute the addresses. Over here under Authentication 2 is where we can configure whether we'll use Windows authentication, which we will be using, or Radius. Again, we don't have that network policy server in place. We don't have Radius turned on. We'll deal with that in the very last course in this series. So if I hit Finish here, that completes this also setup. And then if we scroll back down here, we can take a look then at the infrastructure servers and their DNS suffixes that would be used by direct access clients. You'll note here that we have a couple of different servers that we need to identify as internal DNS servers, and that the server addresses for these machines are set up as what is effectively an IPv6 address. Now, whether or not you're using IPv6 in your environment, if you're planning on using direct access, it uses IPv6 as its mechanism to connect clients to servers. Now, I talked before about some of the protocols that direct access uses and how there are a variety of them. For environments that are not IPv6 friendly, shall we say, many of these protocols are used as a translation or a bridge protocol between IPv4 and IPv6. For the servers that are participating in direct access, if you have disabled their IPv6 stack, you will want to re-enable them before you get to this point. That IPv6 stack will be used by direct access to manage the connections, even as the addresses are translated from version 6 to version 4. So I won't change anything here. I can hit the finish button and then hit the OK button to go through completing this process. Let's now complete the direct access wizard by hitting the finish button here. This will, as you can see, apply all the changes that we've made and create those group policy objects so that we can begin working with direct access on our clients. Now you may notice we have a couple of warnings up here. If I click the more details, some of these warnings, there's a long list of green check marks as you can see, but one of the warnings is that Windows accounting cannot be used because we need to get a network policy server in place in order to support Windows accounting. We'll talk more about that when we get to NPS in that final course. Also up here we have one more warning that discusses the NRPT entries. And here in just a minute, we'll go through the reconfiguration of that name resolution policy table so that the clients choose the correct DNS server for the particular A record they're interested in resolving against. I will choose Close here, and that will go through completing the installation of Direct Access.